Hey, good morning. God's blessings to you. We are in John chapter 11. This is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Really well known story, and we're actually going to see the miracle today in our reading. Quick word about Lazarus. The Hebrew equivalent of his name is Eleazar, and Eleazar and Lazarus both means one whom God helps. Now, Eleazar in the Old Testament, there's a few, but the one that I think is the most compelling to talk about in connection with this Lazarus is the presumed heir of Abraham. So this is before Abraham has Isaac, and he thinks that Eleazar, a distant relative, is going to be his heir. But God says, no, Eleazar is not going to be your heir, so Lazarus isn't going to be your heir. One of your own sons is going to be your heir. Now, I know this is a little bit of mental gymnastics, but in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells a parable where he names one of his characters, and it's the only parable in which Jesus names one of the characters. And of course, that's Lazarus. That's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Rich man, he is wealthy in this life, dies, but he goes to hell, so he suffers in the next. Lazarus, very poor in this life, dies. He's a believer, so he ends up going to heaven. And of course, where is he? In the bosom of Abraham. And so this is what happens when Christ comes. It's this great reversal. It's the ultimate rags to riches. Lazarus, Eleazar, same person, same name, goes from being rejected as the heir of Abraham to now, since Christ has come, he goes to being in the bosom, to being the heir. And of course, that parable ends with the rich man in hell talking to Abraham and saying, would you at least let me go talk to my brothers? Would you send Lazarus? Would you send somebody, raise him from the dead so that he can go convince my brothers that they need to believe in Christ to repent? And Abraham says, well, no, because if they don't believe Moses and the prophets, then they will not believe if somebody comes back from the dead. And so you see that connection with Lazarus and the raising of dead at the end of that parable. Of course, that's what happens with Jesus. He raises Lazarus from the dead here. Next week, we're going to look at the fallout from that. People don't believe. People actually get angry about it. Now, of course, lots of people do believe. But ultimately, this sets in motion the plot to kill Jesus. Jesus comes back from the dead, and they still don't believe. And so it is amazing how corrupt sin has made our hearts, that we could look at a guy who came back from the dead, several men who came back from the dead, and still not to believe. Okay, that's your quick introduction. The reason I bring it up today is because this text is fairly familiar. I've got a few things to point out, but I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. That's the plan, at least. So let's start. 11, verse 28. When she had said this, and that would be Martha, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And I just highlighted that because it's always interesting to note the titles for Christ, and they're all true. So teacher, prophet, rabbi, which of course is teacher. And they're all true. The challenge is they have to all come together. So he's not exclusively just a teacher. And so this is one of the logical fallacies where people say, well, Jesus was just a good teacher. Well, no, he said he was Christ. That's what he taught. And so he's either got to be telling the truth, or he's lying, or he's a lunatic. But nevertheless, he is a teacher, but he's more than a teacher. Verse 29, and when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. And now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now everybody's following her, and so this really sets up the scene. This is a very, very, very public miracle that Jesus is going to do. Verse 32, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, real quick, that's really simple, but we should go to where Jesus is. And so, of course, he's everywhere. This is where he is promised to be. I will be with you always to the end of the age. He's omnipresent because he is God. And yet, it's a little bit different going to church, because that's where he's promised to be in grace. So we go to where God has promised to be in his word and the sacraments. Of course, he's omnipresent, of course, but we know that in his word at church, that's where he's going to be offering us forgiveness. Verse 32, she fell at his feet. A lot to say about Jesus' feet. Remember back in Luke 10, this was a gospel reading earlier in the summer. It's a classic story of Mary and Martha. Martha's busy with much serving, but Mary is sitting at Jesus's feet. And of course, in John 12, which is just after our reading here, Mary anoints Jesus's feet. And so what's the big deal with feet? Well, of course, we get Isaiah's prophecy, how beautiful are the feet that carry the good news. Jesus carries the best news. Going back even further, though, in the Old Testament, all the way back to Genesis 3, the seed's foot, his heel, would crush the serpent's head. And that's what we're looking forward to. That's why Mary is going to anoint his feet, because these feet are going to be bruised on the cross, but that's how we're going to win our salvation. A lot to say about Jesus' feet. Of course, those are the feet he walked with, and we follow him. Let's continue, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, that's the same thing that Martha said, except if you go and look back at verse 22 now, Martha says that in verse 21, and then she adds something where she seems to make a distinction between Jesus and God, and we know that's not a good distinction. Of course, there's a good distinction between the Father and Jesus, the Son. That's true, but she seems to make a distinction between God, Yahweh, and Jesus. And of course, Jesus is fully God. But notice with Mary, she doesn't do that. It's just, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. Period. No qualifications to it. Verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now, a lot of people have a lot to say about this. I think my best take on it is that he was angry. That's one way of taking the Greek. And you're going to see a ton of Jesus' emotions come out. Of course, in verse 35, Jesus wept. Jesus is fully human. That's one thing, of course, to pull out of this. He hungers. We know he ate. He was thirsty. He said, I thirst. He experienced the full emotional range that we experience too, except he did not sin, of course. So Psalm 4, be angry and do not sin. So Jesus is able to do that. And in wisdom, we can do that too. Sometimes it's really good to be angry, except the challenge for us is letting that anger turn into something else which is sinful. But being angry in itself is not a sin. We see it with Jesus when he clears up the temple. So what's he angry at here? He's angry at sin. He's angry at death. And we see him suffering with his people. So the question often comes up during a disaster, well, hey, where's God in all of this? And of course the answer is he's right there with us. Look at Jesus. He is weeping alongside of Mary and Martha. And so whenever you're grieving, hey, Jesus is right there with you, and that makes all the difference in the world. Just to have God with you. This is Emmanuel in the fullest sense of the term. Verse 34, and he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. And that's emphasized. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, we're told 2 times that Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And he loved them so much that he waited for this to happen. And now he's going to show his love on a whole different level. He's going to raise them from the dead. Verse 37, but some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Now that might seem like a ridiculous question to us, because it would seem like raising the dead is a greater miracle than opening the eyes of the blind. And in some sense, that's true. But if we're just working with the Old Testament data, there are 3 resurrection miracles, 1 by Elijah, 2 by Elisha. So that's 3. There are 0 times that a man had his blind eyes opened. So it would seem then that opening the eyes of the blind is more impressive just by sheer statistics. That kind of thing is reserved for the Messiah. So that's why they're asking it, because some people clearly thinking, well, this is the Messiah who opens the eyes of the blind. So then he's going to be able to raise the dead too. Verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, notice that, his full emotional range, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Of course, this should make us think of Jesus' future resurrection, and that's what this is. This is a preview of Jesus' resurrection, of our resurrection. And one of the things to contemplate here is Jesus fulfills the law. And what does the law say? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So in order for Jesus to raise the dead, he's going to have to give up his own body. He's going to have to die. That's the cost. So the miracles aren't cheap. They're going to cost Christ his own life. Verse 39, Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." And you sympathize with Martha because she believes, and yet there's this doubt. Martha, don't you remember what I told you? You're going to see the resurrection. And this is what Jesus says. Verse 40, Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you?" And this is what preaching is. Oftentimes it's just really simple. Did Jesus not tell you? And this is what happens on Easter morning when you got the angels there at the tomb. Don't you remember what he said to you? That's what Bible study is. It's a reminder of what God has said. And oftentimes it's really, really simple, but we need to be reminded over and over and over again. So Jesus is just reminding her, I told you this already. Just return to what I said. And that's the best advice for us. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? And that's the key here too. So the glory of God has been fully displayed, and yet you can only see it. You can only see it. And remember, he opened the eyes of the blind. You can only see it by faith if you believe. Verse 41. So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." And notice, first person he talks to here, it's his Father. Always wants to talk to his Father, always praying. "I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." Remember the purpose of John's gospel. These things were written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. This is the whole point. Jesus is doing this so that you might believe. Verse 43, when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." And of course, this is a preview of our resurrection. This is what happens in baptism. We got that white garment on, kind of like this, except they go from being dead clothes to being made clothes of life, white linen garments, beautiful baptismal imagery that we have. We go into the tomb and then we come out as a new person, just like Lazarus. Now, we'll talk about the fallout of this next week, but just contemplate this. Lazarus dies once. He's going to die again. And that's true with all the miracles. Jesus heals them, and yet they get sick again and they die. And so ultimately the purpose of this is so that we would believe, so that believing in him, we who die would actually never die, as Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life." All right, we'll probably try to aim to finish John 11 next week. It'll be ambitious, but hey, look at that. We did 17 verses this week, so nobody can stop us now. Hey, God's blessings to you. See you soon. Thanks.